Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strangeness of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman-Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unseen Paranormal. Today we are welcoming a friend of mine, Mr. Brandon Schexnayder from Southern Gothic, the podcast. If you haven't listened to this podcast, it's great. I love it. It's a story-based podcast, but he has a little twist where he gets to the bottom of the actual stories of hauntings, the folklore, to see if he can actually prove if it's something that's real or something that's not. And I think that little twist is awesome. He just surpassed 1 million downloads, which is amazing in the podcast world. What's up, Brandon? How's it going, man?
What's going on, Eric? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on today. You were nice enough to invite me out to your Franklin ghost tour in Franklin, Tennessee, and we had a blast that night.
Shoot, I wanted your help. I wasn't inviting you out of the kindness of my heart. I wanted you to come out and talk about hunting ghosts, man.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a good night, man. We got really lucky, as we were talking a little while ago. Tennessee weather, it's different every week.
Yeah.
You never know what to expect. But we had a really nice night out there, and we had probably about like 35 people come out for that tour for a good night, and ended up in the cemetery at the end, because why not, right?
Right. Yeah, and what I loved about it, it wasn't like the normal ghost tours that you go on, because you kind of gave it your Southern Gothic spin, like your podcast, and kind of got to the bottom of some of the stories and called bullshit on some of the legends and the claimed hauntings that people just take as the gospel because they've been passed around for generations. Yeah, well,
that's really what I like doing more than anything, like you alluded to with Southern Gothic and all this. Well, let me start with, I'm not a paranormal researcher the way that you might be. I don't go out and hunt ghosts or look at hauntings. I typically focus on more of these stories that are the local legends. So we joke about it like, what's the story your mama told you? And then let's go find out what really is the story that your mama told you, So really what the tour was kind of that extension of the podcast, of course. It was like, okay, well, here's a local legend here in Franklin. Now, let me go back and see if I can figure out, what are the hyperboles here? What really is real? Were these people really here? Was there this big a family? What really are the historical accuracies? And then from there, try and figure out, well, how did this historical basis get from A to B? And what we find a lot in these episodes and everything is it's a lot like a game of telephone, right? You have something happen somewhere, and then that kind of gets a little embellished and a little embellished and a little embellished. And then the next thing you know, somebody who was, I don't know, like the local midwife or something, ends up this mischievous voodoo queen that's destroyed a town, And so I really enjoy kind of going back and doing the research and kind of following through that way. So, yeah, it was wonderful to be able to do it kind of with my own little adopted hometown here in Franklin.
Yeah, so you're originally from New Orleans, right?
Right, yes, New Orleans, born and raised.
So you started Southern Gothic Media with your sister. So how did y'all get into diving into the folklore and being so interested in it? Because your sister that's what she does for a living.
She's a smart person. She's not one of us, right? One of these kind of
right.
She's a weirdo as well, but no, she works at the Louisiana State Museum. She's an archivist. So she's her job description. She does research. She just sent me pictures the other day. Somebody brought in a bunch of voodoo dolls to donate to their collection, and Brienne was kind of cataloging and trying to preserve these voodoo dolls for the Louisiana State Museum's collection. They found them in a cemetery down there, but. Essentially what we did, the way we kind of got started with Southern Gothic and all of this is growing up down in New Orleans. Obviously you're just kind of into a little different stuff. If you do kind of have it, you got, your vibe picture tribe, right? It's kind of a weird vibe down there to begin with, but our parents were genealogists or amateur genealogists. And basically this is what they did on the weekend is they were just really into digging into genealogy back before the internet was around. So they used to drag us to, libraries all the time. They'd be on those microfiche machines and going through stuff and dragging us up and down the Mississippi River to all these old cemeteries, So they'd actually bring us out to cemeteries and, my dad would be taking pictures and all of tombstones or gravestones, headstones. And this is kind of how we grew up. This was their main hobby, and we kind of went with them. So Brienne kind of took it to the next level by getting into actually working in the archives and being into it that way. I, of course, had to run off to Tennessee to work up on Music Row for a little while, but obviously found my way back because I like stories. I mean, that's the thing that I loved about working in country music. Even, this is a story town. It's a storyteller town, and the music here is storyteller. And so, my sister and I had that kind of background together, and we were trying to figure out something that we wanted to do to kind of work together. This really came very naturally for us to land in this kind of space here. It felt like home, that kind of thing,
Yeah. And when we've talked about this before, you told me that, when you were a kid, you did not like your parents dragging y'all around. You were like, you wanted to be teenagers and kids. I'm like, what the hell? We don't care about all this genealogy stuff.
I mean, you're 10 years old and you're in a library all Saturday, like for real, Mom, or just, I mean, shoot, you talk about Louisiana heat, my dad's family is 300 years on the Mississippi River. They came down 1720s. And so we would be on, you're down on the Mississippi River in some cemetery in August with 90-degree heat and 90% humidity, and just in a cemetery. Like what are we doing here? So we did not enjoy it, but it shaped us. It shaped us.
Right. Right.
So but now we can't go. That was kind of the joke with this tour is, you can't come hang out with me anymore without ending up in the cemetery. We're going to end up in a cemetery because, really, that's what, in merging all of this, the thing that I've come to realize with these cemeteries is you can't walk 3 feet without finding a lifetime of stories literally right there at your feet. You can walk through this cemetery and just every single spot is a lifetime of stories. There's a person there, that can be researched as heavily or not as you want, and it's fascinating. I just think cemeteries are one of the most fascinating places in the world.
I think also it makes it real for you. It makes the stories and the people more real when you can see their headstone and their grave and more of a evidence that they lived.
Right.
Even in doing, research for paranormal investigating, like if I can go out and find somebody's grave when I'm doing research on a property, that's great. Like I said, because it gives that more human element that they actually existed instead of just a story.
Oh yeah, the thing for me. Well, I hear my sister being in the archives, right? She always talks about how her favorite thing to do to connect with a story is if she can find a document that person signed. Okay. And that's kind of her thing is documents, right? And just to know that I am now holding or standing in front of this document that this person that I've written about, I've researched about, has signed this document. They were here. They put their name here.
Yeah.
Whereas I've always been one that, like you're saying, if I can go and stand at that spot where I knew they were, and for a cemetery to be there, you think about, just standing in front of this gravesite, and to think about all the family that would have come, to think about, if just to bury this person, just how this was the end of their life, and kind of connecting with it that way, like I said, I'm not a paranormal investigator like you are, but there's power in that energy. you know?
Yeah.
There's feels there, These people were here. It's really, really powerful.
So with the what I like with the podcast is you've kind of gone state by state, and that's how you have it kind of set up on your website. If anybody goes to southerngothicmedia.com, and people can actually pick by state different episodes that you've done in those states, and you stick to the South because it's Southern Gothic. But what are some of the weirder things you've come across that maybe you put on the podcast or you didn't? Weirder stories or history that you just found weird? Because you tell some weird stories. So if there's some that you think is weird, I think I want to hear them.
Oh man, I'm scrolling through here the list just to see what's really popped out. My sister and I, we weekly. I just got off the phone even with her. We never really know what we're going to end up working on next, because sometimes you'll start something and there's just this giant rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah.
And you think that you can go down this rabbit hole. One of my favorite ones is something that Brienne really took to the next level. It's a story down in New Orleans that a lot of people have heard of. It's the Sultan's Palace Massacre. I'm not sure if you and I ever talked about this. It's really popular, but this is why I find it weird. The story itself, if you were to go on like a French Quarter ghost tour and you were to go walking through the French Quarter, they would stop in front of this old 3-story building right there in the French Quarter and then tell you the story about how one day back in the 1870s, when New Orleans was Reconstruction era New Orleans, all this money had been lost. Everybody was basically poor, and the man who owned this mansion just needed to do something with it. He was behind on his bills, right? And all of a sudden, this man swoops into town and swears he's a sultan, right? He's from the Ottoman Empire, something like that. Swoops in and decides he's going to rent this place, pays top dollar to rent this place. Next thing you know, boat pulls up, a whole harem comes out of this boat. They're bringing furniture, they're doing everything, loading it all into this beautiful French Quarter house. And there's just parties there for weeks, giant parties, extravagant parties. The smell of opium and things are kind of wafting through the air. You got like the whole deal. Everybody in town's wondering what the heck's going on inside this building, right? What's going on with this kind of strange deal? One evening, there's this giant storm comes through New Orleans, and everybody just kind of, stuck inside, and everything. Next morning, they wake up, and it's silence out there, and they don't know what happened. Well, a man walks by the Sultan's palace that morning. He walks by, and sure enough, what does he realize? There's blood coming out from under the front step, pooling down into the sidewalk from the front step of what the quote Sultan's palace. So he calls the cops. The cops come to investigate the Sultan's palace. They go in, and everyone in the building has been massacred. All the women, all their bodies have been chopped up, right? Arms amputated, heads chopped off, decapitated, the whole deal. Giant massacre, pools of blood everywhere. And what you find in the middle of the courtyard, because those old French Quarter buildings, right? Kind of have that reverse courtyard out back.
Yeah.
Is there's a hand sticking up out of the ground, and that's the Sultan's hand. He's been buried in this pile in the back. And this is the story that they'll tell you on ghost tours now, and they might start kind of talking about all the things that could have happened, what might have happened, all this. The Sultan supposedly, it could have been that the Sultan was this guy who had he'd stolen all this from her brother, who was actually the Sultan, and this guy stole his brother's wealth, or all these different stories have kind of developed out of the story. But my sister took this story to the next level. And this is what I think is just crazy weird. And talking about that game of telephone, how what she did was she went back and found old city directories and found all this stuff to look at the building itself. And, most people realize that the Sultan didn't actually happen, or this particular story didn't happen, but we found a different version of it even further back. And so we stop there and we look at it. And it's like, okay, well, back, years prior, there was a story about this random Sultan coming to town in the 1720s, like way earlier. And there was this story of this guy, and basically the governor of Louisiana kind of put him out on the edge of town at this property. And the story developed about how after he left, this palm tree began growing in the back of the building, right? And they called it the tree of death. Okay, is this random palm tree. It was a palm tree that could have only come from overseas. This wasn't native to New Orleans or anything. And so this story kind of developed, and then this other story developed, and all these stories developed, and then Brienne finds like yet another thing. There's this famous New Orleans priest called Père Antoine. And Père Antoine, he's infamous because he came to New Orleans during the Spanish Inquisition, and he wanted to be a part of the Spanish Inquisition in New Orleans and wanted to be this rigid, ideologue. And New Orleans basically sent him back to Spain and said, "I don't think so, buddy. That's not happening here in this city. We're going to continue debauchery, right?"
Yeah.
But he loosened up, came back to town, and became a really big, popular figure in New Orleans for a long time. And he's one of the 6 priests, I believe, that are buried in the St. Louis Cathedral. Anyway, it turns out that there's this whole other story. Père Antoine lived in the spot where that building was built. And actually, he had his own date palm tree there, and there's all this stuff written about it. So this story that's now about a massacre of a Sultan and all of these strange things going on and all this stuff was really just this giant gumbo of all of these local legends that have just been kind of smattered together. And it's fascinating to see that because, it's all oral tradition until it's not. It's all oral tradition and it's all kind of put together, and then maybe somebody writes about it, or maybe some Yahoo like me or something goes and gives a walking tour. And just that night, there's a pretty girl on the tour, so I try and scare her a little extra. And then the next thing you know, this new little addition that I made just to kind of get a little extra rise out of the crowd that night becomes a part of my regular repertoire. And then I start saying the story all the time different. And then, it grows from there. And that to me are the cool little weird parts, now,
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to go weird in a less academic way, we could, we could definitely, there's other weird hauntings and all, but Sultan's Palace to me is one of those super fascinating, twisty, turny stories as you kind of dig down. And we have done an episode on it, and it's lengthy because of all that history.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that fascinating to get down to where it actually came from. And that, none of that, it's all bullshit as far as the, massacre and all that goes, and blood running out, and, there's embellishments that you would get on this tour.
Yeah. And, we talked about on this here in Franklin, we talked about that one story that was the Cloudstone Bride.
Yeah.
And it's a story that's been told forever about this young woman who committed suicide the night before her wedding. And without giving it away, without giving away the whole story or anything, it's not real. It's not, there's no evidence to it whatsoever. And as of now, don't really know why it ever even came up. I mean, we got some theories and all, and I might not ever know how this became a big story. But the key thing that I really like to say, especially about Cloudstone Hall over there, is that so much stuff has happened in this building that we didn't need to make up a story for a ghost.
Right, right.
Like this building has had its share of trauma. This building has had so much go on with it. It might be one of the most haunted buildings in this town. We didn't need to make up a story, but yet this story kind of defined it for a long time. It continues to really be the most popular story out of it.
Well, and that story intrigues me because people have even seen what is supposedly the ghost of the bride hanging.
Right.
And
yeah, there's a picture.
Yeah, but and there's a picture out there that has been passed around and of supposedly, the bride hanging, but the story is BS. It never happened. And so at that point, you get into okay, because it's been passed around so many times, is it like a tulpa, that it's something that's just taken on a life of its own, like a poltergeist or something?
That's an interesting theory. Yeah. And I don't really dig a lot into that part of the paranormal because I'm currently on the kick, I don't write or talk a lot about that part of the paranormal. I usually stick to the more, like I said, the story research end of it.
Right.
But it's fascinating because the more that I work in this and the more stories that I read and all, the more I get pulled to that whole trickster concept of how, a lot of these different things that are going on might actually be the same thing, but presenting itself in different ways, depending on the people and all that. So, I mean, again, that's not something I write about. It's, that's me kind of as like a civilian being into that part of the, the paranormal. To me, that is the most fascinating part when it comes to actual haunting. I think that's, I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, and just to clarify for listeners, even though that, a lot of what you do is diving into the history to kind of debunk some of these stories, you still very much believe in the paranormal.
Oh man, the more you read, it's almost like the more you try to debunk something, the more you realize there are some things that are just out there, and you just are unexplainable. And I think I say it a lot of, you can come in to debunk something and you find out that, there's a lot of stuff that's total BS, more than most people even will admit to. But man, there is this 1% of what you hear that truly is just so difficult to even approach with a logical or a rational mind to think of it being anything other than just paranormal. To me, at least, that's how I felt. And because I really have, I've approached this, I've approached this like Scully, right? Even at the end of X-Files, she's impregnated by an alien. No spoilers, right?
Right.
This is, you do so much, you end up finding things that just are such aberrations. So yeah, I do. I think my concept of what the paranormal is probably skewed in a different way than most people when they start. And it kind of ends up off in a different world because of the academic part. I don't know what the best way to explain it is, but yeah.
Well, I think, if you're a good paranormal researcher and investigator, you should have that mindset anyway. Right. Even though you're not an investigator or anything, but I think, yeah, most of the really good investigators and researchers that I know out there, they're trying to get to the bottom of, what is fact and what is folklore, and what's, how these stories have been, like you said, the telephone game over the years and gotten trumped up, and what actually is modern day sightings of a spirit and modern, and things like that, instead of just these legends that you get on tours and history tours and ghost tours and stuff.
Yeah. I was at the True Crime Podcast Festival last year and led a panel with some guys talking about how true crime and the paranormal intersect. And somebody asked the question to the panel of like, well, why don't I ever hear any ghost stories of somebody who died last year? Right.
Yeah.
And, and the fact of the matter is, we both know if you truly believe in the paranormal, then sure enough, that spirit could be there that, could have visited you the night they died. That's not a necessary paranormal question, but it's a very cultural question.
Right.
And a lot of what I do is almost more people trying to come to terms with history and with some of the more traumatic elements of history and very local and hyper-local parts of history and things of that nature, as opposed to really coming to terms with the fact that, grandma came back.
Yeah.
I guess is what you'd say. And really, you can even go deeper with that particular question, even go into just this whole ethical consideration as well. I'm not going to give a ghost tour and talk about somebody who passed away here 5 years ago that they say they're seeing their ghost because, his wife still lives around the corner.
Right.
So there is kind of that. But as a paranormal researcher, or a ghost hunter or something of that, if, you would take that in because you're not treating it as entertainment in the same way that I might.
Yeah, and a few weeks ago, I guess it's been a month ago, when I talked to Katrina Weedman, we kind of got into that. And one of the cases that she was talking about that affected her was a recent one. We kind of got in that whole question, and it was actually from New Orleans. It's a famous murder-suicide. Now this place is haunted. And
yes, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, people actually see the guy. He killed his girlfriend and then killed himself. And people actually see him, and this place is haunted now when it wasn't before. And it was upstairs, like above a voodoo shop. So that, plays into the story as well. Was all this conjecture around, was he driven mad because they were above a voodoo shop and all this other shit. But yeah, she said that was probably the one case that really bothered her because it was so recent, and that they, she could relate to those people, because if they were still alive, they'd be around the same age as me and her. In our, late 30s, early 40s. And like they grew up listening to the same music, dressed the same way. She's like, when she saw the pictures of them, she said, it was different than going to a historical place because of that. And she said it still kind of haunts her a little bit and sticks with her because it was so recent and she could relate so much to both of them.
Yeah. Yeah. That was that's one that's bugged me a lot. There's a museum in town that has the oven that was in that property in their museum. And I just don't quite know how I feel about it, but, and this is coming from somebody who lived through Katrina as well, so there's a different element, my sister won't even watch a documentary on Katrina, because it has so much going on. But, there's another story right now that kind of happened upon, and I've been going back and forth of whether or not I'm going to do some research into it or write about it or not. It's the Mad Butcher of New Orleans. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one. essentially the story goes is you had a German man, and I cannot remember the specifics. I haven't dug too deep into it. So anyone that knows the story better than me, pardon the misinformation, but essentially on Ursuline Street, it's considered, one of the most haunted blocks in America, right? Which is the famous tagline in every town.
Right.
And this building in Ursuline, he is, I believe, a sausage maker, butcher, something of that nature. He needs to hire some help. He's a German immigrant, decides to go down to the docks to try and find another young German man or something to help out, come to the store and help make sausage. Well, he goes down to the port, ends up with the prostitutes, ends up running around doing the whole New Orleans thing. Wife finds out, gets mad, they get in a big fight. Husband kills the wife, chops her up, turns her into sausage. Whole deal. Everything you'd expect about this French Quarter story of a sausage maker. Well, eventually, one day, somebody's eating some of this man's sausage, and what do you know? They find a ring in the sausage. Ground her up, made her into sausage. So, of course, the police come knocking on the door. What do they find? They found some of the remains of his wife in a trunk. I believe it was a trunk. They start questioning the man. The man starts saying, he's like, man, I don't know what happened to her. I thought she left me. And he's just really, really adamant about he's heartbroken because his wife has left him. His wife had left him, and this isn't real. I didn't do it. But then all of a sudden he just kind of flips, and he flips in this kind of, I don't know, like an exorcist kind of way, right? He flips over and he admits to the whole thing, and he's this whole other person, and he's admitting knows all the details of the crime, and then he flips back and forth, and kind of in this really schizophrenic way. And of course, he gets hauled off. Well, about 30 years later, right down the street, I can't remember how many doors down, but it's still Ursuline Avenue right there. What do you know? A very similar murder happens. I think it was a deli or something at that point. A man and his wife get into a kerfluffle, if you will. Man kills the wife. I think he shoves the wife this time in a crate. I can't remember. But eventually people find out. Same deal. He says, I don't know. What is yada, yada, yada. Same thing. Police are talking to him, wondering, how'd this happen? No, I swear my wife left me. And just schizophrenic kind of thing, going back and forth. And that happened. He gets hauled off. So this has kind of been a legend in Ursuline. Well, back after Katrina, there was a similar situation to like you're talking about, that famous one. And this one was, in the news as well, where during Katrina, someone was doing house-to-house checks after Katrina, and they smelled the remains inside of this apartment or something. And sure enough, they found that this man had done something to his girlfriend in a similar fashion to the other story you're talking about. And they found someone did this, and he acted really weird about it and made a lot of claims. And he actually did this before Katrina, but the woman had been in this crate or in this box all this time. He had put her remains, and he claimed he didn't do it. And then he kind of supposedly just acted strange. Well, this more recent story has been moved in. Just some people are now trying to say that is part of this larger thing on Ursuline, because it happened a few doors down and some of these things. But when I started researching it, this girl who had been murdered, I mean, her parents have been very vocal on the internet and have been very vocal about the issues surrounding this. And right before COVID, Don Wilder, who does the Discovery Channel, what do they call Mysteries of the Museum guy, right?
Yeah.
He put out a series called, it wasn't Dark Tales. It was something like that. It was Dark Stories or something. And he went down to New Orleans, and he actually discussed this. And the local tour guide told them about this newer one, but they didn't use the last names of the more recent people. So it's interesting how ethically, the more I've read into it, the more uncomfortable I would be attaching this to this old legend, but it's happening anyway. And it's a really difficult gray space to be in. But this is how legends inevitably get made. These are real people at the start of all these legends.
Right.
I know for some of our stories, we've really gotten uncomfortable at times, even with 100-year-old story, of going and digging through a tale. And then at the very end of it, at the bottom of this rabbit hole, there's a mother. There's a mother who is sad, who is depressed, who's lost children, or or anything of that nature. There's real tragedy there. It's just 100 years old now, right?
Right.
So it's fascinating. And the guys in the true crime world deal with this all the time now, and there really is a large movement for this kind of ethics in true crime at the moment that I think will do us all better at the end of the day.
Yeah. There's because there's so many true crime podcasts out there, and also I think in the paranormal world, I wouldn't come on here just ethically. I wouldn't come on here and talk about a case that I've investigated. I would talk about the historical people, that had lived. But if there was something more recent, then I would stay away from that. And I think because I'm a true crime nerd as well, and listen to lots of true crime podcasts, and I think they have an ethical duty to stay away from some of that stuff. I mean, if it's in the media and all that, then I understand. But there are still victims out there that aren't dead, when it comes to the families and stuff. And so, yeah, I think ethically, staying away from stuff like that. And that's probably why you don't hear a lot about, recent hauntings and recent ghosts more than you do. There are stories out there, but I just think people don't share them out of respect because, like you're saying, there still are people around who knew these people. And a lot of times the hauntings come from tragic circumstances of murder or suicide and things like that. And so, yeah, I think people just keep those more close to the vest than putting those stories out there when, if the person lived 100 years ago or even 80 years ago, it's a bit more easy to talk about especially a haunting,
Yeah. Nina Instead of Already Gone, she's a fairly big true crime podcast, and she's got the golden voice, by the way, Eric. She just sounds incredible. She's a velvet voice, and you could listen to her describe these brutal happenings all day and fall asleep to it. But she told me once that the difference between what I do and what she does is that I'm trying to go as far down through the roots of something, like the roots of a trauma, trying to go as deep as I can. And her goal is to cast a large net to help the families, to help them gather more information. She's not trying to get down to the cause of it necessarily. She's trying to bring awareness to it.
Yeah.
If that's the best way to say it, how do we help victim families, and how do we help this victim achieve the personhood that they deserve? So it's interesting, I mean, the kind of trends in history as well, and storytelling in the history world have also done this. And when we talk about it, well, on the tour the other night, we did Reconstruction history. We talked a lot about Reconstruction history, how, the personhood of a lot of minority communities, how we really need to try and reestablish the focus of this was a human being. This was a human being that went through these tragedies. Just slapping a label on this is really not going to do us justice. And it's going to help our story. Right. It's going to help the entertainment value, even if that's what your goal is. So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all working toward the same goal there, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I think that's one thing in the paranormal world, we don't talk about the ethics of it a lot. I think there are most of the people in the paranormal world are pretty ethical and respectful because we understand kind of the gravity of what we're dealing with, even in some situations of a haunting not even being recent, like a recent death, but sometimes you got to be sensitive because you go to a location, even a historical location, and they still have living, relatives that you still have to be respectful of that because their relatives still live in the area. And so, right. To go out and spout a bunch of BS and be salacious details and all this other stuff, it's just unethical. And then also going into, doing private investigations in people's homes. And I think that's probably where the majority of the experiences that you're going to have that'll be like more recent deaths and tragedies is going to be in people's homes.
Right.
So for the most part, you're not going to talk about those anyway. I've talked about a few, every once in a while I'll talk about a few private investigations I've done. I'm not big into doing private investigations, but I have had people reach out and I've had teams reach out for my help. And, that's between me and the homeowner. I'm not trying to put their business out there. I might talk about the experience that I had there, but I'm not going to, blast out there. This is where we're at, and these are the people's names, and that type of stuff.
Yeah. Well, we'll say that the paranormal community that does these investigations, their ability to help preserve historic locations is like unparalleled to any. It doesn't matter how historic a place is. If you can have paranormal investigations, you can bring in the money.
Yeah.
Like people are fascinated with it. And I think that's one of the just lesser known upsides to paranormal investigation, that there's such a keen awareness that the community is trying to preserve these places and trying to keep this intact for other people. It's wonderful, man,
Yeah, I've talked about that quite a bit here on the show, and that's why I love doing the events. And I don't make any money off of most of the events that I do, because it's all about putting that money back into that historical location to preserve the stories and the history and for more generations to enjoy. And, I love it because when people come out to do events with me, I'm very history focused. And so, I like to teach them the history, but then they get entertained by the paranormal aspect of it, of all the, us actually ghost hunting and trying to contact these spirits, but they also learn something at the same time.
Right. Yeah. You're in that spot, man. I'm telling you, the energy's still there when you end up there. There's nothing like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love we've talked about, Carnton over there, going over to Carnton here in Franklin, where the Battle of Franklin was. And just, there's something about standing in the middle of that plantation where, whether you believe that Miss McGavick is showing up every night on that, on that balcony, or whether you believe that's true or not, if you go at 10 a.m. in the morning and were to just stand in the middle of that building and look at both sides and just imagine 10,000 Confederate troops coming up your front lawn and all the smoke and the smells and everything, how is that energy not still seeping onto the ground there? I just can't. There's no logical way that this place hasn't felt some type of scar because of that.
And to wrap your head around what the family went through and what those soldiers went through, and that place being still has bloodstains in the floor to this day. And
right.
Yeah. How could that energy not carry over with all of that going on? Yeah. It's pretty crazy.
Oh yeah. 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 We're obviously, we're talking about Franklin here, and there's just so much. There's so many stories like that here in every town. And that's why I like sticking to the South in general at the moment, is so many common themes in each of these Southern towns. And there's this microcosm in all these little towns of people and a somewhat shorter history, like someone who's born in London is going to think that an antique we have is just so much secondhand, right? Because they got stuff going back to 500 years, whereas the South really has this limited time span that you can really focus on, of all these kind of different groups kind of getting shoved together within the span of 200 years. And we have similar stories everywhere. And we have this one conflict that so many communities have kind of, bonded over for better or worse. So anyway, we could go down any of those rabbit holes for sure.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and even after we did the Franklin tour, we stood around and talked for an hour and a half about the paranormal.
Oh yeah. After I know you can talk all day.
Yeah,
it's fascinating, and I know. Shout out to your friend Alan, who has that book on the ghosts of Franklin. It is a really, really well written and researched book, because he takes it building by building in that book and did a really good job of kind of just, you can walk through and just see this history of every single one of these buildings. It just goes so far back. And that's what's fascinating. I know we talk about Third Avenue there, Third Avenue being like the most haunted spot there. That it was residential for a very long time. So you had stories, centuries of stories from generation after generation of the same family that could go through this kind of oral tradition and then end up in a book, 200 years later. So yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, I'm working on my own book about small town haunts and legends of Tennessee. So I've been kind of diving into the stories around Tennessee, and a lot of these places that I'm writing about and doing research on, their families are still around.
Yeah,
and some of them are pretty notorious hauntings around Tennessee when you get to the local area. But other people outside of the area don't really know about these places, and a lot of them are historical places. They're museums now, and you can go take tours and stuff. But yeah, finding some fascinating stories. And you were talking about doing research and going down rabbit holes. Yeah, I've hit a few of those that have turned into really interesting stories to put in the book that are not just paranormal, but but about history that even being a Tennessee native, I've never heard. And these interesting people and legends and folklore, like even a lot of people, like you had an episode on the Wampus Cat, and and that used to be a huge legend around Tennessee, and now, you know, nobody hears about things like that. The oral tradition has somewhat died off with the internet, and to where a lot of these stories aren't. You can find stuff about the Wampus Cat, but it's not the same as people passing down these stories in the Appalachian tradition and things like they used to.
Right. Yeah. You know, and it's interesting because it does kind of move to a new level. It changes the way the stories evolve now. So just to kind of give you an example of that, even, you know, we did some research into Lake Lanier in Georgia. And the story behind Lake Lanier is, Georgia had a bunch of these, well, a lot of the South, a lot of places in America, and these man-made lakes, right? And Lake Lanier was made, it was a dam was built, and this area was flooded because they needed a water source for Atlanta. Okay. And of course, what they had to do was they had to buy out a bunch of these farming communities and take their land, essentially. You know, some of them were well paid, some of them weren't. I believe this was the 50s that this happened. So what you ended up having is you have these man-made lakes that have ghost towns underneath them. Okay. You have, I mean, just whole communities that basically up and left. Some of them were moved away, some weren't. Well, Lake Lanier is considered one of the most dangerous lakes in the country at this point. More deaths there every summer. You know, you have like 3-4 deaths there. Okay. And they believe that it's cursed because of that. And for when I started doing research on Lake Lanier, maybe about 5 years ago or so, the belief was that Lake Lanier was cursed because the Army Corps of Engineers did not move these cemeteries. They left, you know, these sacred places there. They didn't move the bodies, and they flooded this all in. And now today you have people will claim that they have arms pulling them under the tide. All these kind of strange things are happening there. And it's, you know, like I said, I mean, every summer there's probably 2 or 3 deaths on Lake Lanier still to this day. Well, this story's kind of evolved, though. The story, because of the internet even, and because of common occurrences. So, you know, so this isn't something new. Like I was saying, it's something that happened back then, but now the internet's kind of taken its own way of doing it. I mean, just even in the last 3 years. So 3 years ago, a book came out called Blood on the Root. Okay. And this book basically chronicled one of the cities down at the bottom of Lake Lanier. Back in 1912, they had a lynching occurred. It was called Oscarville. And a lynching occurred in Oscarville where a young black man was accused of raping a white woman. He was not given a fair trial, nothing of that nature. He was lynched, killed in Oscarville. And then they basically ran out all of the black people out of town. And Forsyth County was almost entirely white. And still to this day is almost entirely white. And this legacy is there. And Oscarville is now on the bottom of Lake Lanier. Okay, so this book came out, I believe it's 2018, 2019. So everything up until now about Lake Lanier has been very focused on, well, this is cursed because of the cemeteries. But now with the internet and things starting to come about, and even I think it's 2 years ago yesterday was the George Floyd case happened, and you have this shifting of cultural awareness of wanting to tell more minority stories. The internet has now kind of merged this Oscarville tragedy into this now might be the cause for Lake Lanier's curse. And it's absolutely fascinating to see it in real time. Now, that's as kind of a third-party observer of it, trying not to get involved in well, you know, what really has cursed it or not. I don't know, you know, and that's certainly something. Both of those things sound like they could be real reasons for the lake to be cursed.
Right.
Or it could just be, hey, this is Georgia, hold my beer. 3 people die on the lake every summer. Right. It could be any of these things, you know, but the internet has kind of given way for this new narrative to start changing, and a new way for people to take these kind of older legends and put a different spin on it. And that's in a way that they weren't able to do before. You know, television kind of started doing it some, when with ghost shows, they've been able to kind of switch legends, but now it's almost democratized version. But it's fascinating, man, and it's fascinating now because in 2022, the stories that we see are they're getting changed in a way that are nicer. I don't know how to put it. Look, I do Southern stories. Race is involved a lot in the stories.
Right.
And the stories of 1920 very much were heavy stereotypes of race, and they were very, very heavily stereotyped. And now the stuff in 22, as you watch it evolve, is evolving in more human needs. It's evolving more in personhood, at least now. So anyway, so the internet has had this incredibly different impact. If you can kind of step back and watch some of these stories in real time and kind of see the hallmarks of them, like you're saying, the Wampus Cat might be no more.
Yeah.
In 20 years, but my 8-year-old scared to death of the Wampus Cat.
Well, I think in other ways the internet's done really good things for the paranormal, because you can put one of these stories out there and then hear from people who've actually had their own experiences at that location or with whatever phenomena, whether it be ghost or Bigfoot or cryptid or, so it connects people in a lot of way. I think the oral tradition is kind of dying off, and I don't like that because me and you grew up before the internet, and not that we're that old, but so I remember people sitting around telling stories and listening to stories from, the older people in my family and older people that my parents knew and stuff. And so I just think it's maybe for me, it's just nostalgic. Maybe I'm just getting to be one of those old guys, like, get off my lawn, but
no, you're right. It's just, they're changing differently.
Yeah.
There's one, it's been a long time. I don't do a lot of cryptids. We did that was kind of our Patreon special thing, is we did a bunch of cryptids at one point, and I've sort of forgotten some of my cryptid lore. There's an Arkansas cryptid that you basically found out is the product of Reddit and the early internet creating this monster.
Yeah, you've also got, you got other things like the Slender Man that have come around with Reddit and the internet.
Yeah.
Even with the Slender Man, you've got people believing that it's real. And there's a famous true crime case of these two little girls trying to stab this other little girl to death because the Slender Man told them to do it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And that's, just with the advent of Reddit and people putting these short stories out there and people believe them.
Yeah, yeah. It's the Ozark Howler. That was the story. Like Slender Man and everything. It's a new wave of urban legend.
Yeah.
In its own way.
Yeah. I've been sifting through urban legend as well with doing research for the book, because when you look all around the country, and even like I found this all over Tennessee in these small towns, you get these same urban legends of like these stories about bridges, turn your headlights off or flash your headlights and this will happen. Or like railroad tracks, if you put your car in neutral on the railroad tracks, these kids that were killed on the school bus will push your car over. And those are all over Tennessee, and everybody claims that that's a real thing in their area. And there's many, many more. Like one of the big ones that you hear about a lot, you've even talked about it too on your show, is the Lady in White. The Lady in White phenomenon is like all over the world. And, is this just a folklore handed down tradition of the Lady in White, or is this really how that we just see these apparitions?
Yeah.
But it's interesting to sift through and to have these same local folklore and local legends that aren't really local folklore and local legends. They come from different places, and all these different places have the same ones.
Yeah. And to circle back to the Cloudstone Bride is a really good example of that, because the Cloudstone Bride is a story about a blonde hair, blue-eyed woman who is kind of forced into false love, or however you want to put it, forced into a marriage that she doesn't want to have, or something seems like the end of the world for this young blonde hair, blue-eyed teenage woman in the South. And the way that's why I was tipped off to thinking, this doesn't sound real,
right,
was because this particular stereotype or story was so prominent that when William Faulkner purchased his own house, which is an old plantation, that he called it Roanoke, and when he purchased his house, being the grandchild of a Civil War colonel, he wrote a story. He wrote a fiction story that he told his grandkids and nieces and nephews every Halloween about a woman that is almost the same story, a little different. I mean, there's a little more Civil War involved about, love with a U.S. soldier and, unrequited love and all, but basically another suicidal blonde hair, blue-eyed girl. Okay. And this story's everywhere. I think I've probably covered at least 3 or 4 dead brides in Southern Gothic at this point, because every town or every little region has one. And some of them are true. Some of them are entirely made up. But like I said, it was such a stereotype that even a man of that time, like William Faulkner, picked up on it and used all those tropes, in the 1920s.
There's another famous one here in Tennessee. Is it Rotherwood Mansion that has another kind of ghost bride?
Yeah. So Rotherwood had, it was I just covered this too, so I'm embarrassed by how few specifics I have on it off the top of my head. But yeah, what it was the bride, she went to get married. It was wedding day, and her husband decided, she said something like, out on the river out there, there's I think those are beautiful flowers, and would love for them to be in the church or something of that nature, right? There's a few different variations on the story. And I think they're beautiful. And so, of course, the fiance or the new husband decides to jump on a raft and go get it. Sure enough, he drowns right in front of her face, and of course, to this day, she can be seen walking around up and down the banks of this river, searching for her lost love. It was a very Lady in White story.
Yeah.
So Rotherwood has one. The same thing, the Chapel of the Cross Cemetery down in Mississippi, outside of Jackson. It's Bride of Annandale, Mansdale, Mississippi. There's a similar one. Woman was marrying Henry Vick, a man from the Vicksburg family, and he, right before the wedding, decides to go down to New Orleans to get a new suit, get some business done before the wedding or whatever. What do you know? He gets in a duel and gets shot and killed in a duel for his honor, right? And the church is all done up with all the flowers, like every one of these stories, the church is all done up with all the flowers and everything. And she finds out that he's dead. And now we can see the Bride of Annandale sitting there crying at the cemetery down outside of Jackson. And I visited that spot, and it is creepy. There's a little bench behind Henry Vick's grave there, and I went with my sister and was teasing Brienne, like, "Are you going to sit down?" I'm not going to sit there. I'm not, But the stories everywhere, and some of them, like the Bride of Annandale, have a lot of truth in it. On the other hand, Rotherwood, we can't find that husband.
Yeah,
that died. We just can't. I mean, it's not there. And she passed away. They ended up leaving Rotherwood, and she died in Alabama, I believe. But that husband might not have ever existed. I think we mentioned in the podcast, that the father had written about this woman was supposedly married 3 times. The first husband is the one that the story's about, but in the father's journals, he never mentions a first husband. But the folklore makes it sound like this was the love of her life and all of this and all. Yet, we've got documentation that he should have been in what we've found, right? He should have been in there and nothing. Even her headstone only acknowledges 2 husbands, but the story persists anyway.
Well, Rotherwood is one of those that, I mean, it's kind of surrounded by folklore. Even the way that the Joshua Phipps died, and it wasn't he the one with flies kind of choked him to death or something? Yeah.
Yeah, the vicious slave owner.
Yeah.
He was supposedly, he was kind of like a Laurie type, where he being worse than all the other slave owners and just torturing his slaves. And supposedly there were harnesses and all in the house and a pole or something for him to strap people to and whip them in the living room. And he had a mistress that was a formerly enslaved woman of mixed race. And that's a stereotype that we see a lot in ghost stories as well. But and then he ends up. What happens is he dies. He fell sick. He fell ill, and he had this young boy was standing there, cooling him down or something.
Yeah.
Right, was fanning him because he had come up. He'd fallen ill, and his fever had shot up. And this boy described that from the window, just this swarm of flies came in and overtook his face and flew down his throat. And the boy watched the man's last gasp as flies, overtook him and then left as soon as they came, just in this giant, swarm, I guess. I'm picturing like a murder of crows or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, but come to find out, I mean, in history, he really didn't even die there. He died. He had to sell off the mansion because of debts or something, and died somewhere else.
Well, rather the father did. I believe Phipps still died there.
Okay.
I think Phipps still did. The man before that didn't, and the daughter didn't. The daughter, who's the bride, that's there, did not. But I think Phipps did die there. If I would have to go. I don't know.
Yeah.
Go check out Southern Gothic podcast at southerngothicmedia.com for the real story.
Right. Well, I've got all these stories, especially from Tennessee, rolling around in my head, from researching the book, and Rotherwood is, of course, one of those that I've been researching, and so all the stories just kind of roll together.
Which absolutely crazy. That's a great one, because now, the mansion's still there, and a doctor purchased the mansion. So it's a private mansion. You can't go visit anyway. But the majority of that property is called Rotherwood Estates, and it's like an HOA community.
Yeah.
Which is just, it's fascinating how that changes. So, I mean, now it's basically a suburb.
Right.
What was once the edge of town. I don't know. Have you been out there? Have you driven out there or anything?
I have not yet, no.
No, I'm curious. Yeah, maybe you and I need to take a road trip to some of these places while you're doing the book. It might be fun to go see some of them, because I haven't been to that one. Yeah,
and I've been talking about doing that since it's warmed up, especially so I can put my own pictures in the book.
Yeah,
because I like the visual. Like, I don't want a whole picture book, but like, I like the visual of, okay, I'm talking about this place. Here's what it looks like, so people can actually visualize the place I'm talking about and the haunting and that type of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and as we said earlier, you feel the energy different. I feel like you can't quite. The difference in being able to tell a story when you've been there and stood outside of it versus read it in a book is very, very powerful.
Yeah. Being
able to stand in that spot and kind of soak it in, just the connection you feel to it. Even talking about like the Bride of Annandale just now. We plowed through Mississippi one day, and I think we were only at the Chapel of the Cross for about 20 minutes max. But just going and really seeing it and being able to feel like, wow, this is where all that happened, and being able to look at this church in front of you and picture it. This was built for this woman. This was built in time for this woman's wedding,
Right.
And now we can go back there to her headstone and look at it and just imagine the sorrow that would have been here when this church first opened. But it really helps you understand, feel a little more empathy for them as people too.
Right. All right. Well, I thank you for coming on today, Brandon. I've enjoyed our chat. I love hearing the stories, and me and you could talk for the next 5 hours.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Well, we will off mic at some point.
Right.
So.
Right. All right. Well, everybody can find you on all the social medias under Southern Gothic Podcast, and also southerngothicmedia.com. And also, if you're listening to this podcast, you can find Southern Gothic.
southerngothicmedia.com, and we're on all the apps and everything, so come give us a listen, subscribe, and give us a shout. And if anyone out there has any stories your mama told you, we're always interested in hearing some old stories from small towns that we might not have ever heard of.
All right, thank you so much, Brandon. Everybody out there, stay safe, have a good day. We'll see you next time. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening.
You have come to the end of the line.